So next is configuration elements. So what are actually configuration elements are? It enables you to actually use different kind of variables and parameters in your script. So how to add configuration element is you just have to right click on any of the elements and then hover on add and then go to configure element and then select what kind of actually configuration element you want to use. So mostly used is CSV data setup config, and in that you can actually pass on the different kind of parameter variables which you will be using in your script. So just for an example, if you want to run a particular web application for multiple login and credentials, so you can parameterize those in an external file and you can actually use it in your script. So configuration element enable us to declare variables so sampler can use it, and it totally depend upon the scope. If it is actually on the test plan level, then you can use those variable throughout the script. And if you are using any configuration element that is data for a specific sampler, you can use in that way also. So what are different kind of configuration element are? First is CSV data setup. That is, as I said, that it enables you to read data from CSV files and use it in your script as a variable or the parameters. Next is a HTTP cache manager. It will actually use for to add the caching functionality of the web application. Sometimes we want to disable caching and run the test script. So depending upon your necessity, you can actually configure your HTTP cache manager. Next is HTTP cookie manager. So during the web test recording, we will see this cookie manager because it actually handles all the cookie related things in your web application script. So it basically actually handles your sessions and provide the functionality in your web test plan. Next is user-defined variable. As the name suggests, the user-defined variables are something that user needs to define. Suppose if you have a web test plan where you are actually hitting to a particular web application and to a specific IP, and if you want to run it for multiple environments, that is for test environment or in the uh, pre-prod environment or in the your performance test environment, you just have to configure the IP address of different environment in your application and you can use it as a user defined variable. Next is a random variable. So a random variable is, as its name suggests, that it will actually add some random value to your existing variable. So suppose if you have a particular functionality where you are registering a particular user in an application, and if you want to use it for multiple iteration, you can just randomize your username and password and just go ahead with the registration functionality. After that we have counter. So counter is nothing but a configure element used to create a variable that gets incremented by a specific value. So you can actually configure how much how much it needs to increment in the next iteration. Apart from this, we have JDBC connection configuration, which will be used for JDBC sampler. And similarly, we have FTP request default, DNS cache manager, and so on. Apart from these, we have specific sampler configure elements like LDAP request defaults and TCP sampler config, Java request default, and mostly used is HTTP request defaults, which will be used in your web test plan, where if you want to actually give a definite kind of variable such as host name or port name, you can directly configure in your HTTP request default, and it will be used in throughout all the samplers which will be of HTTP request. So next is logical controllers. So logical controllers are very important. That's why we will do a session of logical controllers in practical sessions also. So theoretically, what logical controllers does is that it will define the order of processing your request. So it lets you control when to send a user request to a web server. So suppose if you want a particular sampler to be called for a specific criteria or condition, then you can use if condition, or if you want to loop a certain kind of sampler multiple times, you can use loop controller and so on. So logical controller, what it does is it determines the order in which user request should be executed. So how to add logical controllers? First, you need to click on the thread group level, and then go to add, then logic controller, and then depending upon your requirement, whichever controller you want to use, you can select it. So these are the different kind of logical controller. We will go through it one by one. First one is critical section controller. So this one is a newly added controller in JMeter. And so suppose if you have a specific requirement where you want actually your particular request to be executed one thread at a time, then you need to use critical section controller. So suppose you have multiple threads, and if you want a specific request which should be executed one at a time, then not in parallel. So if you don't want same request to be executed with multiple thread group at a time, then you should make sure that it should be placed in critical section controller, so that, so suppose if you have three thread groups, and first thread group went into that particular section, that is critical section controller, it will execute the whole part, then only the second thread group will come into play and execute. So it is kind of uh, so certain kind of locking is happening in this particular section. It means until unless the first thread releases it, second thread group will not have access to this particular section. Next is for each controller. So for each controller is used to perform request in a loop based on the value of a set of related variables. So for an example, so suppose if you have a particular requirement with a certain kind of request should be executed depending upon the objects, similar kind of objects, then you might need to use for each controller. So we will discuss this for each controller more in the practical session to understand why it should be used and how it should be used. So next is if controller. So if controller should be used when we can specify a condition, where we should specify a specific condition when it should be executed, and if that condition is not met, that particular uh, section should not be executed. So we'll place those section inside a if controller and execute. Next is include controller. So include controller should be used to provide modularity in your JMeter script. That is, if you want to actually reuse a particular section, so you should use a include controller. The next is interleave controller. So interleave controller is something where actually it will take one pick one of the uh, child element in that particular section and execute it. So suppose if you have five child elements, that is five samplers, which are placed in interleave controller, and if you are running it the whole script for, so suppose 10 times, so on the first iteration, in the interleave controller, whatever is present on the first child component will be executed, and in the next iteration, second child will be executed, and in the third iteration, third will be executed, and so on. So it means that it will actually uh, take one child element at a time, which will be placed in interleave controller, and it will actually execute the next segment in the next iteration. So it will always pick one at a time, and it will work on the sequential manner. Next is loop controller. So loop controller is nothing but, as the name suggests, if you want to actually execute a particular section multiple times, it's irrelevant of the number of iteration you have mentioned in the thread group. So you need to mention those segment in a loop controller. You need to specify the iteration value in the loop controller. So module controller is the next. If we want to reuse a test fragment, that is a sampler or any kind of thing, then we need to use module controller, and it will actually give you control on the reusing a particular segment so that you can reuse it multiple times. So next is once only controller. So once only controller is something that where we would like to perform an operation only once, even if the operation is executed in a loop. So whatever placed in the once only controller, it will be executed just once, and irrelevance of the number of iteration mentioned in the thread group. So suppose there are 5 child elements, those 5 will be executed only once. Next is a random controller. So it is similar to interleave controller. The only difference is that in interleave controller, the number of the execution sequence of the in each iteration will be sequential, but in random controller, it will take single child from the controller, but it will take those in the random fashion. Next is a random order controller. So it is totally different from random controller, because in random order controller, all of the child elements present in the controller will be executed, but randomly. So it is different from random controller, where only one child element will be executed each iteration, but in random controller, all the segments will be executed, but in random fashion. Next is a recording controller. So recording controller will be basically used at the time of recording your web test plan. So we will see this controller in the latter part of the tutorial, once we actually see how to record the web test plan. Next is runtime controller. So runtime controller will actually give you actually random controller will be used to give you power to actually uh, limit your time of execution for a particular segment, irrelevant of your the timing mentioned in the thread group level. For example, if we have specified the value of runtime as 100 seconds, then the elements inside the runtime controller will run for just 100 seconds. So whatever mentioned in the thread group level, whatever the time mentioned or whatever the number of iteration has been mentioned in the thread group, it will not make an impact inside the runtime controller. It will only be executed as much the time has been mentioned in the controller section. Next is simple controller. So simple controller is nothing but a placeholder. It will just give you a placeholder for your all the segments placed in the simple controller. Next is switch controller. So switch controller, if you have multiple conditions, and if you don't want to use multiple if controllers, so you can actually use switch controller, where you can actually mention the switch values where like we can see in different languages, coding languages, where we can actually use switch cases. So similar fashion, the switch controller will be used. Next is throughput controller. So a throughput controller basically actually will be helpful if you want to achieve a certain workload model, and it will actually give you power to give the to mention the percentage of how many percentage of users should be running that particular segment. You should mention in the throughput controller, and all those segments should be placed inside throughput controller. So it will give you a power so that you can control the overall distribution of your users. So it will give you full power, means how much percentage of users should be executing a specific segment. So next is a transaction controller. Transaction controller is widely used because it gives you response time of your a particular functionality. So suppose if you have a particular functionality which contains 5 or 6 samplers, and if you want to check what is the overall time it took for a particular functionality, then make sure that you put all those calls into a transaction controller, and after the execution the response time of combined response time of all the samplers will be shown in transaction controller inside your report. So it requires the grouping of all these requests into one transaction, so that once we execute it, it will give you a picture how much time actually it took for a particular functionality to execute. Next is while controller. So while controller should be used run the run the child elements till a specific criteria is met. So if suppose if you have a requirement that if you want you want to run a particular segment uh, until a certain criteria is met, then we will use while control. That means it will go on execute a certain segment multiple times until unless the criteria is met. So these are all about a logical controller. It is very important to use because it will give you a certain kind of power to actually enhance your script, and so that you can actually define your workload model properly, and you can actually reuse your scripts which has been previously developed. So these all things can be managed through logical controllers. Next is preprocessors. So preprocessors are something that actually will always execute before the actual sampler request. So it is something like if you want to do a certain kind of thing before execution of a sampler, then you can use preprocessors. So we will see this preprocessor in the during the practical sessions to understand. As of now, we will see the different kind of preprocessor which will be used in our execution time. So different kind of preprocessor are pin shell preprocessor, then we have BSF preprocessor, HTML link parser, JDBC preprocessor, and so on. Next is post processors. Post processors are widely used at the time of doing correlations or capturing the dynamic variables. Then how to add those post processor are just go on to a particular segment, right click, and then add, then go to post processors, and depending upon requirement you can use your post processors. So there are different kind of post processor which will be used in different kind of test scripts. So widely used are regular expression extractor, which are widely used at the time of capturing dynamic variables or dynamic parameters from the response. So apart from this, we have boundary extractor, which is similar to what we have in load runner, where you need to mention the left boundary and right boundary, and it will capture the middle value. And apart from this, if you want to actually capture something from the CSS selector, then you can use CSS selector extractor. And being chill post processors, if you actually want to write some kind of logic, or if you want to actually extract a value and save it in an external file, those things can be done using bean shell post processors. Apart from that, we have XPath extractor also and JSON extractor also. So these all will be used for specific requirement. So we will see those things in latter part of the tutorial.